Okay, hi kids. Test is tomorrow, and I want to make sure that I top off our unit with a whole bunch of little factoids, a few hints, corrections. Um, Make sure we get all the vocab straight. Um, as I'm rebuilding our units, I often realize, oh, I guess I didn't mention this last unit or whatever. So I have a bazillion little bullets for you. Um, that are either filling in stuff that I had to cut elsewhere in the course due to our reorganization, or that I realize looking at your AP test, maybe I didn't mention and I should have. Directly and specifically to this time of this year, I do need to remind you that if it's in the study guide, it's fair game for the exam. And a lot of times I do not lecture on stuff that the book does well. Um, you can take that as a hint. There's like a few questions where I was like, oh, the book does a good job, and that's on the exam. Um, I'm really worried that a lot of kids fake it on the homework under the assumption that I'll just babble enough in class. And that's a lot of babble, but that's not enough. You really should do the homework. I expect everybody to do that. And the class is made so you can pass just by faking the homework. But I think if you want to do well on the exams, you really do need to make an honest effort on the homework. Also, a specific hint about tomorrow's exam, you will be asked to make a graph. It's simple, uh, kind of similar to the graph I showed you about salinization experiment. So some data points that fit on two axes, little bloop, 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 and then you'll be asked to curve that. The graphing skills, I think, are fine. I think everybody will be fine. You don't need to be nervous about that. Um, but the part that might be a hassle is how you're going to turn that in. You could print the question and write on it if you're taking the test right next to a printer, but most of you aren't. You could just use blank paper and just sketch the axes. Make sure you copy the numbers and try to keep it, kind of squarish. So if it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you just draw that. Boop, boop, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that you can like put your graph on that. You could make a digital drawing, like screen grab, PDF. If you don't use that technology all the time, I don't recommend it. The College Board will have a math question every year, and graphing is about half. 1 year there'll be graph, 1 year it'll be calculations, 1 year is graph, one it's calculations. So I will always include about a third of our exam content being a math question. So this is a math question this year. And you don't have to practice any complicated math. There's really no calculations, but you'll have to make a graph and then you'll have to upload it to the College Board. If it's not working, send me a screenshot of what your problem was. Like show me on your screen what the problem was, just screenshot, send me that, and then send me your graph. But I think you'll probably be okay to turn it in. Inside the text box, there's like the little picture logo where you can press that to upload a picture. Okay, here we go.
Uncertainty could create an opportunity for conspiracy.
Sorry, that was some radio for us. One thing that we should probably cluster as a theme of food stuff is that meat sucks. And I'm sorry to like attack someone's culture. I come from the world's number one meat culture. Number one. It's probably worth knowing that that's Argentina, Australia, United States are the top 3 meat consumers per person, and I'm from number 1, Argentina. I love meat. I was raised on meat. It's a big part of my family diet. It's a big part of my family events when I'm around other family. But environmentally speaking, it really does suck. for one thing, we have less and less, we have more people of rising wealth globally. So meat consumption is growing very quickly globally. It's an important thing to remember that the first thing you do if you're poor and someone gives you a little bit more money than you're used to, the first thing you do is eat. And so globally, we have a bunch of people that are going from once a month to once a week, or from once a week to twice a week on meat consumption. Don't forget the whole 10-to-1 thing. And keep in mind, we already have a whole bunch of arable land dedicated to feeding livestock, roughly 40% of all of our arable land. So if we're going to double the total meat supply globally, then we would have to double all that land dedicated to feeding cows, and that's not possible. We don't have that much land. So really, we could either use our arable land to feed humans or to feed livestock that we eat. There's that 10-to-1 thing. So essentially, you could say that a poor person is in competition with cattle, right? If I'm a farmer, I could grow carrots for this guy. Carrots don't give me a lot of money. Or I could grow grain to feed the cows. And if people are really raring to go to eat their cow at any cost, that's going to pay me better. And so a lot of farmers are like, well, growing grain for cattle is more profitable. And if I'm going to feed one person burger, I could have fed 10 people whatever the burger was eating. And so this is like a really interesting social justice thing. Also, we live in an era of climate change, and cattle are a primary source of one of the hottest greenhouse gases. I'm adding this now. You do have to know this. That gas is called methane, or CH4. It is hotter than CO2, 10 times hotter per molecule, meaning it makes more heat in the atmosphere. And cow farts, primarily because we feed cows a diet that makes them fat quickly. It's a diet that they're not accustomed to. So instead of them eating green stuff and digesting it slowly, we feed them carbohydrate-rich grain, and that stuff makes them fart. They fart a lot. It's a lot of farts. I'm going to stop saying fart. But livestock is a major source of one of our hottest greenhouse gases. You may have heard that there was like a national proposal to limit how much meat we grow in the United States as a way to address climate change. That's real, and that's probably really smart. At least changing their diet, like more of a natural feed, would lower that. That would probably be a wise regulation. It's important to point out that red meat has very negative human health consequences. A little of everything is probably fine, and I'm not a doctor, but to eat a lot of meat seems to give you more fat of the wrong kind of fat than you want to be eating, raises cholesterol, cardiovascular problems, increases your likelihood of heart attack and stroke, especially if you're already vulnerable to those. And finally, meat sucks because the runoff, the water that leaves feedlots, slaughterhouses, butchering operations, is a primary source of really severe water pollution. So I hate to do this. I mean, I love to eat meat, but meat kind of sucks. And this is to a lesser degree true of all industrial meat. So pork is not quite as bad calorie for calorie, but it's still really bad. And chicken is not as bad calorie per calorie, but farming livestock is pretty harsh environmentally. I left a couple things out of forest stuff, or maybe I said it in not all my periods. Number one, clear cuts are a primary source of sediment pollution. erosion is two problems. Erosion is the loss of soil in one place, and then where that soil ends up, it's a problem because now it's water pollution. Darkening water is a big deal. It settles on the bottom, and that's a big deal. I'll explain how that's water pollution later, but for now, trust me, that is a type of water pollution. And this is worse when you cut more land because there's more mud moving. This is worse when you're near water because there's less things in the way. And this is worse on steep slopes because that mud is more likely to move. So a lot of the ways that we regulate clear cuts is to make them smaller clear cuts in little tiny pockets. Like if you could just clear cut a little bit, you might remember strip cutting. Or if you can have a distance between your clear cut and the river, like a 1 mile buffer zone along the river so that the mud won't reach the river. Or if you're not allowed to clear cut when it gets past a certain angle. These are a lot of the ways that we regulate clear cuts to limit the erosion and thus limit sediment pollution. I got to remind you that forests are a sink for carbon. This has come up before too. And whatever happens to those trees, that carbon in the wood will go back to the atmosphere. Whatever happens. Remember that carbon is stored inside living material, especially plants, in carbon bonds. In trees, it's a carbon bond called lignin. I don't think you need to know that. But it's a chain of carbons that make the plant structure. They're like little tiny fibers. And so trees are strong like a bunch of spaghetti taped together because lignin. Anyway, that lignin is carbon bonds. And so termites eat the wood because there's a bacteria in their stomach that digests lignin. And when you light wood on fire, the heat you get is because you're breaking the bonds in lignin. Whatever happens to that forest, if the trees are being disposed of, that carbon is going to connect to oxygen. That's called oxidation. And those carbon bonds are going to be broken and you're going to get CO2. Carbon will be oxidized. And essentially, no matter what you do with the trees, if they stop being trees, you put CO2 back in the air. So rotting on the ground, where decomposers will slowly eat it, mushrooms, for example, fungi will decompose wood, CO2 is released to the atmosphere. Catch on fire in a big forest fire, all the carbon bonds are broken, that carbon will oxidize into CO2 and you get huge CO2 clouds coming out of forest fires. Cut it up into little pieces, take it to your house, stack it next to the fireplace and burn it when it's cold. Out of your chimney goes a whole bunch of smoke and CO2 because all those carbons will be oxidized into CO2. Anything we do with trees, beside leaving them there, puts the CO2 back into the air. And don't forget that term, oxidation. We talked about forest, and I might have missed an opportunity to remind you that that's an inherent tragedy of the commons. If that's a resource that we share freely, someone's going to keep cutting trees and taking the last trees. Unless, you set up a system of rules. Like, hey man, you can only take 5 a year, that's government. Hey man, you can only log in this area, that's a way to avoid everybody logging everywhere. If everybody can take whatever they want, the forest is gone. This is what led to regulated grazing on federal land, rather than letting people go graze willy-nilly. If you don't own the land, of course you're going to let the animals overgraze. It's like, well, nobody's looking and I could just keep feeding my livestock, so screw it, they'll just overgraze. So as you can see on my slide, too many people visiting is why we started the National Park Service. Too many people grazing is why we started the BLM and the National Forest Service. Too many people shooting ducks in the same pond is why we started the Fish and Wildlife Service. These are all federal regulations to resolve tragedies of the commons. I want to talk a little bit about pesticide. One detail that I'll just tell you right now, it's on the test because it's frustrating, but I don't know. They always want you to know this, so I'll just tell you. IPM is not about removing every bug. This is like a concept that shows up on a lot of exams. You just need to limit pest to a tolerable level. The whole hope of pesticide is that maybe we can kill every last bug, and you really need to do that if you're only growing one thing. But in IPM, you just want to get the bugs down to like an acceptable level. Like, you know, if you're going to lose a couple of broccoli, maybe that's still cheaper than spending a bunch of money on pesticide. So the tolerable level thing shows up on a lot of tests. There's two vocab terms that I didn't mention. Look at that little graph that I squiggled on my screen. You've got pest populations. You apply pesticide, and pesticide's really good. Let's imagine it kills 99% of bugs. That's always going to leave some. And you need to remember the ones that survive are the ones that are really tough. Maybe they have a different shaped head. Maybe their shell is extra thick. Maybe they have a habit of, you know, spending time on the bottom side of leaves. There's probably some genetic reason that the 1% survive. And when those guys are looking for a mate, they'll be like, hey, survivor. So you've got survivors breeding with survivors, and their genes become more common. And so, for one thing, you have pesticide resistance. That the more pesticide you use, you're just going to select artificially the ones who are resistant to pesticide. This also means that after you spray, bugs will come back and they'll be slightly improved, you know? That's called pesticide resurgence. And eventually you get into this pattern where you spray pesticide, but all you've done is kill off the wimps, and you know you've got this super bug generation coming back tomorrow, so you got to spray again, and you're not going to get every one. You're just going to get more bugs tomorrow, so you got to spray again. And this is called the pesticide treadmill. I hope you understand the word. A treadmill is a place where you do a lot of work, but you stay in the same place. So you spray a bunch of pesticide, but you're always going to have some bugs. That graph that I squiggled, that's really famous. A lot of farmers during the Green Revolution are like, yo, I'm glad we're growing a whole bunch of rice for the world, but look at this graph. We always have bugs, and we're getting more and more bugs, and we can't afford all these pesticides. Or we're ruining all of our rivers, and now we can't get fish because we're using too much pesticide. And the constant pesticide application was a huge downside of the Green Revolution. That kind of changed things. A lot of farmers pulled back from the Green Revolution because of that graph. It's a really famous one. I got to talk a little bit about fish. A, I love fishing. B, this is the #1 protein source for humans. And you know, the ocean is big. It covers 70% of our Earth or so. All nutrients go to the ocean, so the ocean is really productive. Technically, if we could manage the ocean well, it would be our largest producer of food, much more than land. But also the ocean is the world's biggest tragedy of the commons because most fishing happens in international waters. And, you know, everybody has access to international waters, and it's really tough to make rules about sharing in the ocean. It's really tough to negotiate internationally. You might have heard that the era of international negotiations has passed. You might have heard that some countries are falling out of favor in the international community or have decided not to participate in the international community, including our nation. And so when it's tough to make rules for sharing, a lot of places just don't share. Quick story, I got to surf Tavarua for a week. It's a small island in Fiji. And I wasn't really in surfing shape, and I was there with an old buddy, and we'd often just like hang out and talk about his personal life. And I wasn't like trying to wake up early because when it was really big, I was kind of out of my league. And so at night, we would often see the fishermen. And Fiji has this long tradition of local fishermen fishing their reefs. But Fiji doesn't have an army. They don't have a navy. And so every night you would see the international fleet move into Fijian waters, fish all night, and you could see all the lights along the horizon. And then when you wake up in the morning, you're supposed to be ready to go fishing by sunrise. Sorry, ready to go surfing by sunrise. So you'd be sitting on the beach watching the sunrise. And as you're watching the sunrise, you can just see all the lights disappearing on the horizon as the international fleet left eyesight of the island chain. You know, with nobody enforcing the rules, that boat is like, hey, I think the school of fish just went into Fijian waters, and who's going to stop us? And we've had some really devastating consequences from this being a poorly regulated resource. We have a lot of overfishing. Overfishing is primarily taking too many fish of a particular age, the breeders. So if you just protect the breeders, you can have more offspring. Like nobody wants to shoot the pregnant deer mama, because if you just leave her alone, that's going to make more deer next year, right? So we do not do very well at avoiding breeders and fishing. Often we take the pregnant mama, so to speak, the breeder. We could exclude breeders by size, we could avoid the breeding season, or we could avoid the breeding areas. That's basically the purpose of most American fishing regulations. So wait until they've had a couple of good reproductive years before the size limit lets you keep one. Or fishing season means you can't go during the 2 months that they are most active breeding with each other. Or we're going to close off the area where we know these fish get together to breed. This is the heart of most American fishing regulations. But globally, those are usually the best and easiest fishing when they're breeding, when they're in the breeding area. So we should probably protect breeders. We used to historically fish near shore, subsistence fishing. It's accessible to more people. There's more different habitat. There's more nutrient cycling near shore. But most of that was tapped. We as soon as somebody can get a big boat, they get the hang of it, they can go take more of those fish. And so kind of in a free market moment, when somebody gets good at fishing, they can buy a bigger boat, hire more crew, take more fish. We sort of overfished the coastlines. So now the majority of fishing is in open water, deep water, international water, kind of along the middle of the oceans. And what's interesting is the global seafood yield has continued to rise, but that's not because we have more fish. It's because we got the easy stuff, then everybody turned their attention to the harder stuff, and now there's a mad dash to get the last of the hard fish. Hard to get. And so we can make it look like fish yield is going up, but that's just because we're moving into those last big reservoirs of fish altogether. Every country's like, I don't know, man, I guess we could go for those. All right. And then they're all showing up in the middle of the ocean now. I have some fascinating slides. I wish I had more time to show you the map of where fishing is happening. And it used to be coastal, and then it was like temperate nearshore areas, and then all of a sudden it started to move toward the Arctic areas, and that's already passed. That was like generations ago. And then most recently, it's just all the world's activity is concentrating in these pockets kind of at the middle of the oceans. And that'll probably be time to make some hard decisions there. We're gonna need international regulation of fisheries. We've gone from subsistence fishing to industrial fishing. The three main methods you should probably write down now: long lines, drift nets, and large trawl. And this is like what happened with agriculture and livestock. Subsistence doesn't work anymore. We switch to industrial. I'll have to find a place to show you this movie. I have this spectacular movie about how fish farming looks like a really good idea and turns out to be a total bust. Fish farming is also known as mariculture, like marine culturing. And everybody thought this is going to be the solution, and it turned out to be even worse than fishing in the wild. I'm hoping this comes back in a later unit. My last loose ends. In a previous unit, I mentioned genetic diversity from ancestral corn. Don't forget that that was about corn. So we talked about it last unit, but I said, hey, this is coming up later. Perfect example of how your ancestral varieties have all the genes that you need to solve problems that arise later, like in domesticated agricultural corn varieties. I think I've said everything about irrigation, but now I just want to review it one last time as a clump. Irrigation is watering. Flooding is natural. Farmers used to just put their stuff in the ground after the flood receded. So you'd get flood water, and as that water was going away, you'd plant your seeds, and the soil would gradually dry out as your plants grew up. Flooding is natural. But if you're using irrigated water, like somebody has to capture that in a reservoir and then carry it around the state through canals and pipes, it can be really wasteful. So flooding is a very old school, we would say primitive way of farming, but probably not appropriate when we have a limited supply of irrigation water. And rain is always the best, but you can't control it. It's not intensive enough. You can't grow year round, and all the rain patterns are changing. So most farmers today irrigate using sprinklers. It's just simple and cheap. But crazy thing, about 90% of that water evaporates before it hits the ground. You're only delivering 10% into the ground. And because that's a light mist on the surface, most of that will evaporate off the ground and leave you a lot of salt. So sprinklers are the most common because they're the cheapest, but they do add salt. And the best conservation practice is drip irrigation. It's like a flat tape with little slits on the bottom that let the water droplets out. Drip irrigation. But of course, that's the most expensive because that tape is really laborious to like spread out next to every single plant you're growing. Imagine if you had like 1,000 acres of lettuce. That's a lot of drip tape. So it's a lot of labor, and the drip tape doesn't last very long. You can usually use it for 1 or 2 years, and that's all. So it's super expensive, but it uses the least water. About 90% of the water soaks into the ground and only 10% evaporates. That leaves less salt because you have less evaporation when you're growing a plant. So drip is the probably the way to go conservation speaking, but cost-wise, farmers don't really care for that. I'm assuming that you have questions left over, but I'll stop this video so you can come back to class and ask me. God, I really hope the sound quality worked for this one. Okay, I'm done with Unit 4.